right, another type of bias is called undercoverage bias. So undercoverage occurs when some groups of the population are left out of the process of choosing a sample. So in telephone surveys, they often call during dinner. So if you eat out or you work nights or you are in some sort of athletic or music thing that has practices in the evening, you would most likely be underrepresented in those kinds of surveys. A sample survey of local households will miss things like homeless people, prison inmates, students in dormitories. So we have that empty spot where the Sonic used to be. And if I was going to survey people to find out what fast food restaurant we would really like to fill that slot, instead of just mailing it to everybody who has a house in Gunnison, I would actually want to be much more thorough and definitely make sure I include the college students because I'm going to assume that they're going to probably be a big force that's eating at that restaurant. So that would be a group that I'd want to make sure is represented. Another example of undercoverage, an opinion poll conducted by calling landline telephone numbers. So those are your cord phones that plug into the wall. I'm not sure who all still has those, but if that's what you're calling, if that's the list you're using, you're going to miss all of the people that only have cell phones. Okay, so that'll be undercoverage bias. And then this next one should make a lot of sense as well. This one is non-response bias, and this occurs when an individual that's chosen either can't be contacted or refuses to participate. So you set up the survey correctly. You set up a great plan for a random sample. You had a good list for your population. And you got this random sample, but then somebody in the sample or multiple people in the sample were like, hung up the phone, tore up your survey, things like that. So that'll be non-response bias. And these biases kind of overlap a little bit. So one of the things about non-response bias is it could be something about the questions you're asking or the time of day you're calling or something like that, that you could have groups that are not represented within there. So you get some undercoverage coming out of this as well. So some common issues here. Non-response to sample surveys often exceeds 50%, even with careful planning and several callbacks. I will say one thing about this. We had to do a survey when I was in college, and what we did was all the mailboxes were numbered, and so they went from like 1 to, I don't know, 1,000. And so we did like every 90 boxes. So somebody started with the number 7, and then they had 97, right? So they just kept adding 90, and that was the mailbox number they wrote on their survey. And so I had a roommate who was in this class with me, and she wanted the perfect sample with no non-response bias. So she started leaving like these pretty awful messages in people's mailboxes, like, how dare you ignore my survey? You better turn that in, which only made them even more determined not to fill out her survey. So there is some give and take there. You do try and do some follow-up, but ultimately, you're going to end up with some non-response bias. And so there are some tricks to dealing with that if you take a more sophisticated stats class. But one way of that is we know that non-response is higher in urban areas than rural areas. So a lot of sample surveys will substitute other people in the same area that have very similar characteristics in order to avoid favoring rural areas. So while there might be less people in the rural area, if the vast majority of them actually turn their survey in, whereas like in Denver, maybe only a handful of people turned it in, you would be overrepresenting that rural part. Okay, so there are some ways to deal with that. All right, come back to the next video and we'll look at my favorite type of bias, response bias.